Does the world need more feminists, like a fish needs a bicycle? Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Sidwell, and this, trigger warning, is CounterCulture, the cultural discussion show that believes in discriminating against bad ideas and lazy thinking. Today, we're talking about feminism and the future of the feminine. Feminist ideas hold sway in the mainstream media, in the policies of blue-chip companies, and in the minds of a rump of activists. But for the vast majority of women today, they don't identify as feminists. What explains the disconnect? And is there any way to improve the situation? Well, joining me to discuss this today and stop any more mansplaining, we've got a fantastically talented panel of women. We've got the novelist Lionel SHRIVER, we have the journalist Ella Whelan, who's also the author of What Women Want. We have the conservative commentator Emily Carver, and we have Claire Fox, director of the Institute of Ideas, and until recently, a Brexit Party MEP. Thank you all very much for joining me. Now, I'm going to start by putting an idea on the table, and I want anyone to jump in and tell me what's wrong or what's right with this. Women today are in denial. They have on paper legal equity, but they are in fact living in a system designed by men and for men that oppresses them in all sorts of ways, that imposes damaging stereotypes, exposes them to the possibility of sexual assault, and holds them back in their careers and sees them even paid less for the same work. And the only answer to this ramification of patriarchal oppression is more feminism. Is everyone agree with that? Any problems there?
I think, as you say, there's always this tendency for feminists to look at any issue and see it through the prism of sexual discrimination. And that's the case when we look at the narratives around the gender pay gap. Mm-hmm. It's the same when we look at parts of the Me Too movement and different areas of the feminist lobby. And I think that the discussion tends to be sort of selected around an elite, a sort of metropolitan group of women that have very little to say about the ordinary lives of women and increasingly very little to say about motherhood. We see with the gender pay gap that statistics are skewed in a way as to create these headlines that are deeply misleading. So for example, we're told that women stop working at this day or that they only start working at this day in the year. And this is very misleading because at the moment, there is no pay gap for women under the age of 40.
Really?
It's only after that point that the pay gap begins to widen. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it seems that the biggest reason is that this is actually a motherhood pay gap. This is the moment that, as we see in women's lives, women take a time out of the workplace, and that of course has an impact on their earnings and their lifelong earnings. And there's conversations we can have about whether men should be taking more time out to look after children and what decisions women should be making. But seeing everything through this prism of discrimination, I think, actually does women a disservice who, on the whole, are excelling in the workplace and doing very well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Ella, that point about it being for a particular group of sort of maybe upper middle class women, professional women, that feminism has become, for a very particular group of society. Do you think that's fair? Is there something there?
Well, it's a difficult question because the fact is that in the case of the law and in the case of social norms, there are still differences between men and women. In terms of reproductive rights, women do not have the same legal ability to take control of their bodies. In terms of general social norms, part of what you're talking about with the motherhood pay gap is that chiefly it is still women who are expected to be the primary caregivers. And that's not to say that women are kind of blindly walking through the patriarchy and a life filled with misogyny, not realising it. But it's that the problem is with contemporary feminism, I make that particular distinction of the feminism that's come around in the last sort of 20 years, fourth wave or whatever it's called these days, instead of looking at the actual concrete ways in which women are still not free, there's a general sense of men are just mean to women and women feel like they're not represented. Women are worried about how their identity is sort of realised in the world. It's all this kind of very fluffy stuff, which lends itself to what I've called the kind of middle-class professional feminism, which is that the most important thing you've got to fight for in terms of women's rights is, our ability to speak up in boardrooms, or how many women are on the FTSE 500, or, whether or not you can walk down the street without being wolf whistled at. And it's sort of nebulous, and it often lends itself to a kind of patronising tone which says, the word that you use, women are in denial, is really important, because that's a lot of the time what contemporary feminists argue, that women just don't get that they are being discriminated against. In fact, actually, most women do know that they are being discriminated against, but they choose to act upon it or deal with it in different ways.
Well, my big problem with fourth wave feminism, and I have trouble keeping track, is that its marker seems to be self-pity. And I don't feel sorry for myself. And furthermore, there was a general feeling when I was younger that what we were moving toward was a kind of blurring of the line between the sexes. And increasingly we were encouraged to look at each other just as people with our differences, and not even saying that there were not some differences between the sexes on average. But there was so much, and in this is statistically true, there is so much intersection between the qualities that we call male and female, that on an individual level, you can almost trade places sometimes. I felt comfortable with that. I felt comfortable with not being hung up on what we are now calling gender. And I'm, for most of my life, I've called myself a feminist because I don't know what else, I don't know what other word to use, okay? Because what does it mean? I mean, I grew up understanding that men and women were equal and should be treated equally in a legal sense, and should be paid the same thing for the same jobs. Kind of stopped there. And so, since I don't know any other word that means that, then I continue to use it. But it keeps being transformed so much that it's a dangerous word. And that's, you ask, why do so many people, women, not identify as feminists? That's because it has so much baggage. It's one of those words that means many different things to different people. And for a long time, it seemed to indicate that you have no sense of humor, and that you're obsessed with your sex and are on the lookout for offense, and you have a chip on your shoulder. And I think a lot of women don't have a chip on their shoulder, just want to get on with it. Or if they do have a chip on their shoulder, it doesn't have to do with being female, but the fact that, they hate their job, or they're underpaid, or they're afraid of the coronavirus, or whatever it is their big problem is not necessarily to do with what their sex is. And I don't care that I was born a woman. And I wish I'd hear this more often. I do not give a shit. It's true that I was born female. I'm not in denial. I'm okay with that. I had to be one or the other. I had to be assigned one or the other. And I'm cool with that, because both sexes have their problems and their crosses to bear. But it is not very interesting to me. And I also, as a writer, as a thinker, as a commentator, I do not want to have it imposed on me that I have to do this kind of panel, into which I was dragged.
Very generous.
But it doesn't. I don't want it necessarily to be my subject matter.
And Claire, does it still speak to you, or is it a dangerous word for you?
Well, a little bit like Lionel, maybe. I never know what word to use. I struggle with it. So I associate myself with the women's liberation movement, in as much as I believe in freedom, and I wanted women to be liberated. And they definitely, at a period in the recent history, and even when I was growing up, it was kind of the aftermath of this, there was a sense in which there were different expectations of women and men, and there was assumed to be certain stereotypes of what women would do. And it was, as we all know, and this was in the 70s that you would have ridiculous situations whereby people didn't see you necessarily as equal, and I thought they should. And I really rebelled when I was young against what were considered to be feminine virtues and masculine virtues. It drove me mad that, you know, people would say, you know, masculine was kind of rational, you know, cold, and, you know, and women were caring and soft and all that, you know, and it was like, you know, that's not a masculine, they're not masculine, they're strong and independent. That's not masculine, that's human. It's an aspiration we should all have. Men aren't allowed to just have it themselves, you know what I mean? And I don't want to be the soft caring one at home, because I was never going to fit in.
You know, we should all be, you know, striving for emotional honesty,
Yes.
and to be able to express our feelings. This is not just a feminine,
No.
it is a natural desire of the human state to feel and to express one's
I
feelings.
agree. So it wasn't that that's perfectly reasonable, but it was posited much more as a kind of set of vulnerabilities that required you to be protected from things, and that drove me mad. You know, it was kind of this sense that you needed a chaperone. Now, what's so ironic?
Which we're going right back to.
Exactly. This is what is so ironic. So the women's liberation movement, feminism might be all the rage in the sort of polite society, and in, you know, in amongst you know, everyone that matters in society, but the reality is that actually the women's liberation bit has been totally betrayed by those people who call themselves feminists today, because what we now have is a situation whereby contemporary feminism argues that women need to be protected, that they have a set of values and virtues that they would say are better than the masculine values, so they are demonising, as we speak, independence, autonomy, rational, cool, analytical approaches. They try and say that the feminist values, or that the essentially women's values, can be expressed by, if we have more female MPs, we'll have consensus, because we'll all get on better, because we're all more empathetic, which seems to me to be a reinforcing of those stereotypes of the past, but dressed up in a kind of right-on language. And then they're constantly saying that we are at threat, largely from men, but that's why we have to be protected from dangerous ideas, dangerous words, dangerous men, escorted everywhere in a Me Too era. So that seems to me to have been a completely retrograde step, regressive. And so in that sense, I hate feminism as it's become. I think it is a disaster that we posit our trying to gain support for ourselves as victims. Only just one other thing to say, though, is it is not the case that everything is okay for women. And I draw attention to, for example, the not discussed enough grooming gangs, because I stood as an MEP in the Northwest. This is where a lot of these grooming gangs occurred. And there's a report brought out by Manchester City Council, which, as we speak, exists but has had no publicity. And we know, I'm not particularly wanting to discuss the fact that people are scared of this report in case they get accused of racism because it's largely Pakistani men and or Muslim men. I'm not even trying to get into that. There was the wholesale, systematic sexual abuse of young women in the Northwest, and in fact, not just the Northwest, but in the Northwest. And that is because they were young women. So one wouldn't want to underestimate the fact that there is also something to be said about the fact that real sexual violence can be directed at women. It's just that what drives me mad is when it's relativised in a Me Too era, where we're not allowed to discuss that because it doesn't fit into a certain narrative, but we're to constantly assume that every time a man pays a woman a compliment or touches them, I mean, I'm frightened in the period of coronavirus, I might get WL, but you know, somebody kind of goes, "Are you all right, dear?" or something in a term of affection, this is enough to get you done over, right? And if you're a man, and I think that makes women into kind of pathetic victims of aggression, but I don't want to suggest there's never any aggression around, because there is such a thing as sexual violence.
I think that's definitely why people are so sick of the current feminist movement, because as you say, feminists seem to be ignoring the actual horrors that are going on in our country because it doesn't appeal to them, or they tend to be sort of left-wing liberal and find it hard to discuss issues that involve culture or issues that involve race. And I think it's really doing a disservice to all those young women, as you say, who've been abused for such a long time, that we've just chosen to ignore that. And the feminist movement has focused on, as you say, the touch of a knee, an awkward interaction at a bar, instead of looking at ways that we can really change women's lives. And it's really disappointing. And as you say as well, the freedom element. I mean, the Me Too movement has sort of sidelined freedom. They've put, as you say, the protection of women above freedom. And I think that to have freedom, you have to put, as a woman, you have to be able to put yourself at risk. You have to be able to put yourself at risk of being sexually assaulted, because that is your freedom. And I would prioritise that over the fear of being discriminated against or, God forbid, abused.
Sure, and that's very reasonable. But I mean, on the Me Too question, I mean, what does that mean practically? Because clearly Harvey Weinstein was a rapist. We now know that in court. These were real cases of abuse. There's something to be said for pushing back. What's the liberal way to deal with that sort of problem when it occurs? To rely on women to stand up for themselves, or?
No, I mean, first of all, there's some things that are a matter of law. Harvey Weinstein is one of those cases. But because Harvey Weinstein is a rapist doesn't mean that every sexual harassment case is a Harvey Weinstein case. Mm-hmm. It's also the case that in a period of, if you assess people as being autonomous and self-determining and free, then women can and should be able to negotiate how they relate to men. And I do mean that there are ways and strategies that one deploys, whether it's, making it known to everyone in a workplace that somebody's a, dirty old man and leering and all the rest of it, and humiliating them, and or, giving them a kick, or any of these things. I mean, there's a range of ways that one has deployed over the years, let us say.
And so not the first women now.
No, and I don't mean to make light of what can be a really annoying, unpleasant series of things. And also those men who assume that because you're a woman, that they can take advantage of you if they're your boss. I mean, they really deserve a metaphorical kick in the best of times. But the point is, we've lost all sense of distinction, and that would be where all I want to say is I want to be able to have these conversations. I want to be able to say which bit of this is sexual harassment, which bit is actually flirtatious or awkward behaviour, all of these things. I was kind of quoting in a speech I gave the other day where, one MP was saying, it was a police officer was saying, well, we should be able to intervene if a woman says that somebody is following them out of a shop and is going to give them unwanted advances. That could be seen as a misogynist hate crime. And I said, well, how do you know if it's unwanted? I mean, how are you ever going to chat anyone up at this rate? And I wasn't trying to be glib about it. What I'm saying is, but anyway, even to have that conversation, and this is where we go back to freedom again, is now to be a betrayer of the sisterhood. You cannot have complicated conversations about Me Too. Look at the way that even the great Margaret Atwood, the feminist icon, was called a feminist, what was it, the wrong feminist, or and so on. Absolutely. And she actually said, my goodness, there's a kind of, I'm an apostate, I'm a traitor. You look at the way that women are treated who've tried, Catherine Deneuve, the French feminist, all of these people who sort of said, look, is there a danger that we're actually undermining women's agency in negotiating sexual relations here? And they were accused of having, being lobotomized, internal misogyny, all of these things. So the biggest failure of feminism at the moment is that it essentializes feminism into a one tick box version of events. You have to follow this script. There's a suite of opinions. If you don't agree with them, you're a bad feminist. That was the word they used for it. Yeah.
Well, that's why it's part of this larger identity politics basket of, let's mix our metaphors, basket of worms. And I think one of the things that has motivated the Me Too movement, which is underobserved, is that everybody needs to be a victim now in order to have standing, in order to have moral authority. And Me Too has been primarily driven by white women who are generally fairly prosperous, and no one was feeling sorry for them, right? They were right just barely above white straight men on the victimhood totem pole, and Me Too has vaulted them to near the top. And it's my big objection to it, and I think Claire and I see eye to eye, is that it's motivating women to be offended, and because everyone needs their story of outrage, everyone needs to have been attacked or abused in some way, and that's as opposed to being motivated to getting over in whatever way you might have been mistreated, and also, as you are advocating, employing your own agency and being able to negotiate the workplace and the romantic landscape in a competent manner. And that's where we really need to go back to making a distinction between what is legal and illegal behavior. Because, if we're talking about what Weinstein did, he broke the law, and there is a mechanism for dealing with that. And if all he did was, put his hand on your knee, then you can get rid of it.
It's part of what is going on here. It interests me that the way that there's also tremendous interest from power bases. You see politics, big companies, they're all getting in on the act. And the other side of the victim coin, of course, is that victims need, as Claire was saying, someone from outside to support them and be their big white knight. So there's become this strange alliance between power that's looking for a victim to look after, which sort of justifies their doing more and more rather than leaving them to be autonomous. And that has sort of created an unhealthy dynamic from two directions.
Well, for me, it genuinely boils down to a question of tactics almost, because I think that the biggest shame and the biggest problem that's come out of the Me Too movement is that I genuinely think you have a generation of young women, perhaps certain sections of society, not all, but certainly a significant number of young women who are genuinely afraid, genuinely have interpreted the unwanted attention at the bar as something that is going to drastically change their mental health, their ability to go out again. And I resist the idea of being too cynical about the expressions of the Me Too movement, because if we all sit down and dredge through our past, I'm sure we can all find several, if not many things that men and other people have done to us that if you wanted to fixate on it would make you quite upset. And it's really, it does boil down to a question of tactics, because there are still things that we need to change. There are still behaviours that I would like to see shifted. And part of this is generational. I think, as this new, people deride the woke generation, there's a lot to criticise in it, but attitudes towards equality and rejection of sexism, all of that is changing, and that's a good thing. But if you're going to breed essentially fear into young women's minds that they have to attend to all areas of their life, whether it's workplace or their interactions with men or going out, with a level of trepidation, life is a set of dangers to manage rather than experiences that could go wrong, but also most of the time are going to go quite well and be exciting. That's the most disempowering thing you can do. And so it's sort of the contradiction in contemporary feminism is that the more they tell women to be afraid and speaking out about #MeToo, this is meant to be incredibly empowering, but actually you're just essentially creating a politics of fear. And as Claire was saying, the upshot of that is that you then have a wholesale implementation of protective measures. So the question of making misogyny a hate crime, which was piloted in Nottingham a number of years ago, and I think they had like a handful of cases. It wasn't successful in terms of how they would deem it to be, but was also suggested this would be rolled out nationwide, would amount to, quite literally, policemen watching women on the street, waiting for something to happen. And if you dress that up in feminist terms, that's arguing that women have to be watched by men. And as Lionel said, when did that used to happen? In Victorian times. And so in terms, we want the end point is you want to reach a situation in which women feel free to be as soft or as hard ass as they like without any intervention from men or otherwise. And you don't get that by creating a generation of young women who are afraid of their shadow, basically.
But I do think that a big mistake that the feminist movement is making is to completely leave men out of the conversation. Just demonise them and completely leave them out of the conversation. If you look at businesses, for example, in the private sector, when you have panels on women's issues, when you have panels on whether it's Me Too or just women doing well at work or whatever issue it is, there are never any men there on the panel. This is quite rare that even you're a man sitting here.
And the token, yes.
As a token, and I think
to
it's so
to
bad.
defend this event, there was supposed to be a male.
Yes, to be fair,
Right.
Rafe had a little accent on the way.
This is
But the
an
problem is
accident
that-
that it's all women.
Men are our friends, men are our brothers, our fathers, our whatever, our lovers. They need to be part of this conversation, and I think demonising them in that way is poor. And I think also in the feminist movement and in the Me Too movement, there's definitely a lack of forgiveness and giving people the benefit of the doubt. We've had stories of young men who have got into awkward situations, have been pulled up across social media through the courts for making minor indiscretions, and we've seemed to have lost the ability to sort of just say sorry and to sort of move on from scenarios. There was a young man in Manchester, I believe, who had awkwardly approached a woman, you probably saw it in the news, awkwardly approached a young woman and touched her on the arm. And it ended up going to the courts. He ended up getting a criminal conviction. And it turned out that he'd been looking previously that evening about how to make friends online, not even how to find a girlfriend. And it's just that sort of lack of forgiveness and lack of dealing with things in a civil way. Things don't have to be sort of...
No,
always
but
taken to
I
court.
think we've definitely distorted interpersonal relationships this way. The only thing that I would be cautious of, and I was thinking when you were introducing this programme, I mean, it might be that all of the places that I give talks or whatever is a particular type of person, but I mean, I think everybody, there's very rare to meet people who don't sign up to being feminist, and there's nothing worse than the room full of male feminists. I mean, they're the ones who drive you to distraction. And, Sadiq Khan announced that he wants to bring in a crime against misogyny as a hate crime. He started off just before International Women's saying, he says it every time, but I am a feminist. I mean, it's the great boast, and you were making the point about corporates and so on and so forth. And I've just spent some time in the European Parliament, where when they talk about diversity, it has to be in relation to men and women because it's definitely all white. So they've got this kind of, but it's the most diverse commission ever, and it was half women and half men. But, every man there, obviously I'm exaggerating, but, everyone's a feminist. It's the thing that you sign up to. So in certain circles, that's the case. Just in terms of, but the awkwardness in relation to interpersonal relations is that I think that we're not all gaining from this, because what's happened is that there is a loss of confidence about how to relate to each other. That is the cost that you pay for undermining agency in general. And what to follow on from what Ella said, it's very important
we've also
to understand.
made men so paranoid.
Men are paranoid, but
it's not worth it to make a pass or to express sexual interest in someone.
Which is why I think that that we can see that people are making connections through apps. I mean, they're still having sex, but it's much more transactional.
Far less
do you know
sex,
what I mean?
though.
Well,
Men are having far less sex than they used to.
No, but you're not. But the point I'm making is you're not able to chat people up. So you do a transactional thing, which is, I want this. Are you round the corner? That's the point I'm making. Which is, fine. I'm not making a moral point. I'm old. It's okay. I'm not. That's fine. What I'm saying is that it's because of the murky world of the negotiating your way through. But what I was going to say was that young women are scared. That is one consistent feature whenever I talk. They are scared of that they are going to be victims. And why I think that the problem of free speech is important, and our inability to have these conversations, is if you are being socialised into a world at the age of 14 or 15 that tells you that if somebody wolf whistles or chats you up or says something crass sexually, that's going to mean that you're about to be abducted, raped and tortured in a dungeon, and that you'll never
or
get over it,
even
will destroy your life.
That says maybe you won't be abducted and raped and tortured, but if you have been disrespected with the wrong words, then it's the same thing.
It's the same thing, and that you'll never get over
this
it.
whole idea
It
that
will
words can
traumatise
be
you.
violent.
Exactly. And they then say this will, you know, and there's proof that shows that if you are exposed to the wrong kind of ideas that might traumatise you, that this will destroy your life, lead to long-term mental health problems and alcoholism and drug addiction. I mean, this is literally the literature. What the
Well, some of the things I didn't
now, if
like
you're 14 and then somebody wolf whistles you think you're on a hiding to nothing, right? So, understandably, you develop a misanthropic, you know, you're kind of genuine, and I don't think it's put on, because I do think, well, that's not a good, you know, we used to reassure young people who were frightened, you know, of, you know, children, they would be frightened of the bogeyman behind them. We would, as adults, say, look, honestly, it's okay, that, you know, we reassure you. Now we say it's much worse than even your worst imagination, and give them nightmares.
But at the same time,
I think that softens up their capacity to deal with the challenges of relationships that sometimes can get messy.
Yeah, I was thinking at the same time, there's this extraordinary focus on kick-ass heroines and how you have to tell every girl in every story that she's fantastic and she can be a superhero who can kick men's heads off and beat them up if they try and rape and kidnap her. That's a sort of massive thing in the culture now. Is that a help? Is that needed to get over the scaredness, or is that just completely sidestepping the issue while actually really women aren't feeling like that at all?
I'd actually like to see a bit more of that.
There's quite a lot of it around,
I mean,
surely.
There's, you know,
every film at the cinema.
Yeah, there's, you know, and you get discussions about like what Disney princess should you, or not princess, what Disney character should you be showing your little girls to make her, you know, all these new heroines who are kick-ass, as you say. But actually the more general sense is, and I've had this before where I've, you know, you make kind of jokes saying, when I go out, I, you know, wear steel toe caps and no one's going to mess with me. And you get told that by promoting that idea of women being those qualities that were perhaps previously attributed to masculinity, that's victim blaming. That if you, and I often hear this, that if you say, well, it's a woman's job in an interaction, messy interaction or negative interaction with a man who's behaving badly, that it's the woman's job to stand up for herself and deal with that. We're talking about non-criminal things here. Then you're victim blaming. You're saying that this, you know, and time and time again, I get women saying to me, "Why should I have to deal with this? It's not my job to be the kick-ass feminist." And I'm afraid it is, because how else does the world change? It's the same as, you know, there's this, I think more often than not actually, contemporary feminism is arguing that women don't have to be go-getters, don't have to be brave and bold and, you know, tough in their exterior, but actually that we should be, you mentioned the feminine and the concept of femininity and softness, and we should be prioritising that. So just to take an example, you know, the whole thing of the way women interact in workplaces, in boardrooms. There are like apps now about teaching women how to get their voices heard, because the assumption is that women are naturally quiet mouses who need to have this app to teach them how to lean in, you know, this whole Sheryl Sandberg concept. Which is just completely alien to me and is alien to anyone I've ever met.
I can tell you, Ella, you don't need an app.
I think there is a place for that sort of thing, though, because I do believe that there are some women who do find it hard to raise their voice if they are in maybe an industry that is dominated by men.
Boys who don't know how to raise their voice.
It doesn't have to be gendered necessarily,
Right.
no, I agree with you on that, but I think that in male-dominated industries, I think there can be
Yeah, but what's happened? Yeah, but isn't that the point but that is part of what the women's liberation movement and what feminism had an aspiration to be, which is you would walk in as a woman into a male-dominated situation and you would say, and that was the struggle, I'm equal, don't treat me as inferior. Now, the difficulty is if you then start A, shouting at all the men and saying you've got to let this poor woman speak, or B, sending her off on a course in assertiveness training or give her an app. The whole thing is not equal because you're then treating them differently.
But it was a woman seeking out that app for herself, right? It wasn't done by the corporation themselves.
No, but there is an assumption.
It's the assumption.
There is an assumption that all I'm saying is that is the fight, that is the struggle, if you want. I mean, and I think that, of course, any woman, any of us, and maybe of a certain age, you can say, you know, we've all been treated. You know, I've walked in on situations where, you know, 4 or 5 men are standing around, and I've maybe been on a panel with them where they've just completely ignored me. I mean, I might as well not have been there. And this is like now, not, you know, and they actually treat you, you know, it's like sort of like some, and it, by the way, it's not all because you're a woman. I mean, it's also, you're not in the club, you're not in the, you know, they don't know who you are, you're an outsider. But as a woman, and you know, it's infuriating. But the way that I think that we want to encourage young people to deal with that is then to go on that panel and be absolutely twice as good as them and humiliate them and show them up, right? And I can assure you afterwards they never forget that who you are or anything else. But you have to learn to do that. Of course, you know, when you're 16 it's hard, when you're 20 it's hard, but that was the very aspiration of, in a way, the feminist movement. You know what I mean? We are equal, don't you dare.
And it was an equality that you took for yourself.
Exactly.
You do not sit around waiting to be given
and
it.
you were encouraged by other women to make that intervention, and I'm concerned that at the moment it's the men that are seen to be the problem. Young women are then over accommodated to help them out, as though they kind
What
of
about the women who don't want that? What about the women who don't want to be on the panel, who don't want to be a high-flying careerist?
Fine.
Yeah.
I've got no problem.
No problem with that. But I think the thing that Claire mentioned was, you know, we talk about the sisterhood today, and it gets thrown around, and actually more often than not it means a club of feminists who, you know, professional feminists quite often, who say this is the right way to be a feminist, and if you don't support the sisterhood, then you're at the club. But actually at the start of the women's liberation movement, it actually meant something very serious in terms of different S words, solidarity, where it was like you had there was an onus on women to support other women who were coming up against these battles, and it was a genuine political fight against genuine sexism. But I think the problem today is that we, you know, it's like going back to the kind of the key feminist phrase of the 60s, the personal is political. You have this sense now in which personalities, whether you're a quiet person, whether you're a ballsy person, gets mixed up with the politics. And the politics should be, for women's liberation, that a woman should be free to be whatever kind of woman she wants to be. And more often than not, contemporary feminism today says there is a correct way not only to be a feminist, but a correct way to be a woman. And that means that if, like, for one example that I am fixated on, I'm doing in the middle of doing a documentary for BBC Radio 4 on feminism, and one of the key examples that we're looking at is the case of the good boobs, bad boobs argument, which happened a number of years ago. Funny title, but very serious actually, when there was the campaign to ban page 3 in newspapers succeeded, and there was this absolutely fantastically interesting interview with Harriet Harman, who was key in that campaign. And she said, the reason why we want to get rid of glamour models in The Sun and other tabloids is because it's not feminist, it's not empowering, this is degrading for women, and it's not news, and we should ban it. And they won banning it. And in the same interview, she talked about how empowering it was to see Kim Kardashian, celebrities, good feminists, is the way she put it, bearing their chest because this was empowering. And essentially the distinction there was that there were certain women who were able to own their bodies and display them and be a good kind of feminist, and then there were women who were just fodder for male readers and male editors. And the big elephant in the room there was that there was a class distinction happening. And I think that's the problem that particularly irks me about contemporary feminism, is that it's patronising, not just for all women, but actually particularly for the women who can't. I always get that argument, well, what about the women who can't do that? And they usually mean the mass of women out there who, you know, are so slavish in their blindness to the patriarchy that they can't achieve, like me in my CEO position, or, you know, me in my high-flying career. When it's actually not the case. Go out in Faces in Essex and you'll meet far more high-achieving, tough women than you would in the doors of the BBC.
Well, I mean, you talk about the sisterhood there, and of course it's the opposite of that now, isn't it? I mean, we've talked about it a bit earlier, it's riven by civil war and disagreements about who's the right kind of feminist and the right kind of woman. And I mean, the trans issue has been extraordinary in the way that sort of unpersoned people who are at the top of the feminist tree. I mean, Germaine Greer is almost an unperson in certain circles now, which is sort of extraordinary.
The most fascinating and surprising thing about the trans debate is that I have never called myself a feminist, and I've been critical of not just contemporary feminism, but feminist movements of the past and the whole person's political thing and blah, blah, blah. But on this debate, the trans issue, I've found myself standing shoulder to shoulder with feminists who I would have disagreed on everything else, because the problem is not that that we shouldn't have discussions about trans, or that it's not something to consider, or that, you know, there are some people who argue that it's just the kind of that are genuinely transphobic. But the issue at the moment is that women who have fought for women's liberation for years, Julie Bindell, Germaine Greer, these kind of high-profile feminist figures, are now being told that they're not allowed to talk about women. They're not allowed to use the word woman. It gets put an X through it. And they can't define for themselves what it means to be a woman. And you have to pick a side in that battle, and you have to pick the side of that's being silenced. And in this case, that is feminists. Feminists are, and they're called TERFs, which is a terrible term and used as a kind of slanderous accusation. But really they are old school feminists who have a particular view, who are being told that despite their years of fighting for what they consider to be women's freedom, they're not allowed to talk about themselves as women any longer.
I mean, it's a difficult issue, that one. It causes huge ructions online. I mean, anyone else have views on?
We've seen how it's played out so badly in the political sphere, in our politics. I mean, you've seen the Labour Party tear themselves apart over this. I mean, you've had Dawn Butler saying, you know, biology doesn't exist, babies aren't born with a sex. You've had Lisa Nandy getting in all sorts of difficulties when it comes to lobby groups like Women's Place, who are just concerned with the issue of self-identification, from what I can see, and concerned about the safety of women when it comes to refuges or just women's only places. And I think that this conversation is just so damaging for the feminist movement, and it's so damaging for their cause, because we see such a conflict that doesn't need to be there. If we just have sensible discussions around, of course there's transphobia, but that doesn't mean that you should suddenly a woman isn't a woman, that biology suddenly doesn't matter. So it's well,
like, you are transphobic for that. I mean, you're done.
Right.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think it is extraordinary.
Your life is over.
Yeah, you know, the 50th anniversary of the women's liberation movement only last week was completely destroyed by this civil war within the feminist movement in relation to trans, and the deplatforming of a feminist historian. And all that subsequently went on. But the fact that it was the 50th anniversary of the women's liberation movement and meant to be a celebration and turned into the most acrimonious, vicious, you know, and censorious atmosphere is telling of the moment. But I think that it's a very peculiar situation that feminism has to, now I'm going to say, that those old-time feminists also have to take some responsibility intellectually. So, because what I think has happened is that if you think that feminism was happy to go along with the worst aspects of identity politics, I mean, so many feminists will say, you know, as a woman, right? I find that offensive, or as a woman, you know, and they would take upon themselves that as a woman they were going to be able to have the last word on issues, and the whole lived experience question, all of these different trends, and also very much emphasised that identity was the trump card, and that people should be able to assert their identity and define who they were, and some of these aspects. Then this awkwardness emerges, which is that then what emerges is the idea of self-identification, that a biological male can simply declare, I identify as a woman, I am a woman, how dare you challenge my identity? And everybody kind of goes, ooh, now we've got a problem, right? Because identity politics is suddenly kind of, its potential for narcissism has suddenly emerged in the most gross and grotesque way, as against.
Not just a narcissism, but to the point where we embrace subjective reality and say that's reality.
No, that's right.
And
exactly.
And I think that's
exactly.
dangerous for the entire society.
No, that's right. And that, but all I'm saying is that was accepted as part of feminism. In fact, it was championed by many feminists, the subjective over, the subjective experience above all else. That's what I'm saying about identity politics. And even the essentialising of women and so on, and their unique ways of looking at things because they subjectively saw it that way. So then what do you do when people subjectively turn up on your patch and say, well, I subjectively am a woman, and what are you going to do about it? And you want to go, well, actually, you're a man. And then it's like, so the whole thing is becoming very acrimonious. But it's also last bit, which is just that the difficulty is you can't have this conversation. Right. And I think the fact that feminism is now associated, and liberation movements like the LGBTQ plus movement is now associated with censorship, closing down debate, not allowing any of the discussion or nuance to emerge about whether transitioning sexually is, what do we think about it? It's obviously a peculiar thing. How has it become? No, you've got to go along with this. I'm afraid that feminism sowed some of the seeds for that. But absolutely, as Ella says, now I absolutely stand by Linda Bellos. I mean, most of the feminists I stand by are going, oh my God, who needs an ally like her? We've been fighting with her for ages. But I don't care, they have put themselves on the line to fight for women's equality and women's liberation over the years, and they are now called bigots, and that, at the very least, is utterly ridiculous.
And I mean, the important thing to mention about the Women's Liberation Conference and the history of that is when it was first set up in the first meeting, they had 4 aims, equality of opportunities, and there was issues that they wanted free 24-hour childcare, they wanted abortion on demand, which today we understand as the decriminalisation of abortion, things that actually haven't happened yet and are still their objectives. And they spent the entire time rowing about the fact that they'd removed Selena Todd from it and had spent ages tipexing her out of the programmes. And lo and behold, the actual issues that women still want to have answered don't get discussed. And Claire's very right to say that actually there is a legacy there, because take, for example, something like women-only shortlists or women-only 50-50 quotas and that kind of argument that feminists have been making for a very long time. And the baseline of it is that because women are inherently different, like, as I was saying, because they're more predilected to not being able to get the leg up, to not being able to fight their corner, because they're quieter and softer and more oppressed, we have to have this recognition of me as a woman having this position on the board in terms of representation. And so then logic follows. If you have this different category, trans women or whatever it is, saying actually we need ourselves represented, then it all comes into conflict. And the answer for me is always, well, just get rid of any of these, get rid of the obsession with representation and let people be people. But it's these warring identity politics that has ended up in this mess. And the really important thing to say is the vast majority of women who are not commentators, who are not journalists, who are not politicians, who are not campaigners, don't give a crap. I mean, they really don't. And this passes them by. And, if you go out and stop a woman in the street in any kind of city or area in perhaps other than London and say, what is your main political issue? What do you identify as? I bet my life savings, small as they are, that they wouldn't say feminist, and they wouldn't actually be that interested by the trans debate other than saying, what's all that going on over there? So that's why I wrote a book about saying what women want, because most of the time the discussion of what should be happening for women, what feminism needs to do for women, bypasses the political desires of most women. Yeah,
well, that's fantastic. We're nearly out of time, so I just want to go around quickly and, on that, what should feminism do? What do the vast majority of women need from it that they're not getting now? Just very quickly. I mean, Ella, if you want to.
I think that the number one thing that we have to do as women who are interested in women's freedom is to counter and argue against the contemporary feminist narrative of victimhood. I think it's a real barrier to women's freedom. It's a barrier to arguing for very important things that we need, like the decriminalisation of abortion, which inherently needs a belief in women's agency, a trust of women, a sense of women as autonomous individuals. And I would like to see perhaps the issue of women's liberation, women's freedom put on the map politically more often. I think there are questions of access to childcare that are very serious and relevant for women. But you have to have the baseline as a politics that treats women like adults and treats women like agents of their destiny, And that means you have to have, that's why the subtitle of the book that I wrote, which no one ever wants to read out because it makes people grimace, is What Do Women Want? Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism.
Lionel?
I definitely agree to the point that there is a continuing battle. It should be restricted to matters of substance, and like childcare, like the fact that women are constantly getting stuck with social care. Mm-hmm. That's real. Mm-hmm. That has to do with what people have to do with their lives. Nobody else is stepping up. There are institutional answers. It's an issue for government. But otherwise, stop banging on about being women and what women are like and how women have had a hard time. I'm just sick of it.
Emily?
I mean, I would push back slightly on what on the conversation here. I'd just say that I think that when you have statistics showing that now 1 in 4 pregnancies are ending in abortion in England and Wales, I think that the feminist movement needs to speak more about, make the positive case for motherhood, because I think a lot of women see the feminist movement as seeing motherhood as a sort of obstacle, as a burden, something to overcome, something
a
to
form
sort
of slavery.
Yeah, and I think that we need to be talking about how motherhood can be one of the greatest privileges and joys of being a woman, and that's something that only women can do, and it's something to celebrate. So I think that the feminist movement needs to stop judging women for their choices and start celebrating their choices. And not every woman wants to be a CEO, not every woman wants to be on the board of a top FTSE 100 company, but a lot of women have very different choices, they make different choices, and we need to celebrate those.
That's great, thank you. Yeah. Claire?
It is also true that those women who might choose to be mothers, of which there are millions and the majority, would need to be married to a member of the FTSE 500 board in order to pay for childcare. So,
yeah, childcare is a big issue.
No,
yes.
no, but I mean, but in all seriousness, it is therefore not resolved. I mean, choices are held back by material problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, you know, I want to remove the barriers for women to be able to be equal in society and make whatever choices they want. And there are some practical problems. And I do think that there are issues around the kind of jobs that women do, because it does drive me mad that we talk about the pay gap all the time, but it is also the case that every care home in the country is staffed by women trying to negotiate earning some money to pay for the childcare to get in some extra money, and they are paid very poor wages and they are treated as, you know, unskilled workers and so on and so forth, right? So
I definitely agree with you that we don't value care.
Exactly. No, what I'm saying is, but it's their jobs, and what I'm saying is they're not paid enough. I'm just making the point that I would not think that our job is yet done. I don't think that equality exists, but huge steps forward have been made in terms of attitudes, and I am not trying to overplay the victim card. It's just that I think there's things that one can fight for. The thing that really was important that was said earlier on by Lionel was, I want people to forget that they are women. It is not the most significant feature of my life. This is just the point. I want each and every one of us to be respected for our views, I mean, or disrespected for our views, to be treated seriously as individuals. This seems to me to be hugely important. And I'm not trying to say that I would joylessly not walk around making jokes about how incompetent men are, of which that's often the case, or, you know, and there kind of be all the banter between the sexes. I mean, I'm not saying there's no differences, I get that. But this is the least interesting thing, because the truth of the matter is, I just was born a woman. And I say that in absolute defiance of Dawn Butler and all the nonsense about whether I was described it. You know, I was born a woman, it's not an achievement. I want to be recognised for my achievements. And so that's one important way forward, that we have that as the aspiration. And secondly, that feminism has now got to stop being associated with closing down debate and discussion through playing the victim card. I mean, nobody will ever believe that feminism has got anything to do with liberation if it becomes illiberal, censorious, and basically doesn't allow anybody to be free. I mean, how is that a step forward? So at the moment, I'm of the opinion that feminism is the problem. And I can understand that, and I actually think it has to be confronted and dealt with, even though I'll defend the old-style feminists against the trans activists. I actually think feminism itself is probably redundant now.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to all my guests. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. This has been CounterCulture.